Our guests come from all walks of life. Some just need a place to rest on the way to somewhere else. Others would prefer there's no record of them being here at all. Anonymity is part of the reason people come to the Dreamland Motel. We don't ask questions. We don't keep more than the law requires. That's the arrangement. But every so often, we get a guest so unique, I can't help but share what I've been told. This morning I was flipping through some old comment cards. They sit in a little tray by the front desk, half coffee stained, some written in 3 a.m. handwriting. One read, "Just the place I was looking for. I'll be requesting a late checkout." And another said, "This is my favourite motel." I was halfway through a third one, something about unpacking their bags and never leaving, when my bartender walked in. He looked tired, but not in the usual way. More like someone who'd heard a story he wasn't supposed to hear. He said the guest from room 9 had come into the bar late last night, alone, quiet, wearing a plain white shirt, no jacket despite the desert cold. Sat at the end of the bar for 20 minutes, didn't speak a word, just stared down into the bottom of the whiskey he'd been poured. Then, without warning, he started talking. Not like a man just telling a story, more like someone reading something that had been written on the inside of his skull. He said he was a microbiologist, said he worked in a place a few miles south of the test site, said he met someone down there. Not a man, but not exactly an alien either. Something else. The bartender said he just listened. There was something in the man's voice, no fear, no madness, just this quiet, exhausted certainty. He'd been waiting a long time for someone to listen. And now that someone was, he could finally begin. Welcome to the Dreamland Motel, where the rooms are quiet, the lights stay dim, and the stories we share don't always make sense, at least not at first. Here, we try to keep things simple, clean sheets, warm coffee, and every so often, a guest who checks in with something to get off their chest. Today's story, well, it's wild. Quite literally unbelievable. Even with everything I've come across, this one goes beyond what my already overexposed brain is used to. But there's no question, it's one of the most thought-provoking, most unsettling whistleblower testimonies ever cemented into the long, echoing halls of UFO lore. Now, to be clear, we're not here to prove or disprove anything. That's the job for people with far more access and maybe more clearance than I'll ever have. We're here to tell a story, as it was told to us. This is the story of Dan Burisch. Daniel Burisch was born in 1964 in Linwood, California, a suburb of Los Angeles. There isn't a great deal publicly documented about his early family life. Most of what we know about his upbringing comes directly from his own testimony and interviews. His parents, John and Doreen, or Dodie, Crane, were supportive of his scientific interest from a young age. From early childhood, Dan displayed what would later be described as exceptional intellectual aptitude, particularly in the sciences. According to his accounts, his interest in microscopy began at an unusually young age, developing a fascination with biology and the unseen world of cells and microorganisms. At age 8, he claims to have had an experience that would quietly shape the rest of his life. While playing catch with his grandfather at May Boyer Park in Lakewood, California, Dan and his grandfather witnessed what he described as a chevron-shaped craft that silently appeared in the sky. What followed was a classic missing time event. Hours passed, unaccounted for. The incident would later be understood by Dan as an early abduction experience, one that, in his words, left him enhanced for future purpose. Following that experience, his natural aptitude for science allegedly accelerated. He became deeply engaged in microscopy, pathology, and cellular biology. By the time he was 15 years old, Dan was the youngest member ever admitted to the Los Angeles Microscopical Society, a prestigious association for scientific microscopy enthusiasts. During his high school years, Dan was mentored by Dr. Jim Reynolds, the director of pathology at Long Beach Memorial Hospital. Under Dr. Reynolds, he received hands-on training in medical microbiology and histology, far beyond what would be typical for someone his age. By his late teens, Dan's growing expertise had already drawn the attention of individuals within the US Navy and other government circles, who quietly began monitoring his progress. It might sound unusual, government agencies quietly taking interest in a bright teenager with a microscope, but historically, it's not. In fact, the US military and intelligence apparatus have a long and well-documented history of identifying and in some cases quietly monitoring young individuals who exhibit advanced cognitive abilities, especially in fields like mathematics, engineering, linguistics, and biological sciences. One such program, widely speculated upon in research circles, is something called GATE, the Gifted and Talented Education Program. Officially, GATE was a federal education initiative designed to provide enhanced learning opportunities for intellectually advanced children, beginning primarily in the 1970s and 80s. Many of these children were tested extensively, not just for academic aptitude, but for pattern recognition, abstract reasoning, and problem-solving under pressure. Unofficially, some researchers suggest that data collected through programs like GATE may have been quietly shared or accessed by elements within the military-industrial complex, particularly agencies interested in cultivating long-term talent pipelines. This isn't entirely speculative. Programs like DARPA's Young Faculty Awards, the Office of Naval Research STEM initiatives, and even the early MK programs have, at various times, blended national security interests with academic talent cultivation. In Dan's case, his sharp pattern recognition skills with microscopes and his remarkable ability to analyze biological samples appeared to have put him on a similar radar. The US Navy, which maintains its own highly secretive science and technological development branches, allegedly began observing Dan as early as high school. If you believe his testimony, their interest wasn't simply in his skill, but in what he might already carry with him. By the time Dan reached his final semester at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, his academic trajectory was already impressive. He held a bachelor's degree in biological sciences and psychology. He'd been quietly receiving specialized training in cellular biology, far beyond the standard curriculum. But as he would later describe it, this was the moment his life shifted from science into something else entirely. It started, as these things often do, with a quiet meeting. During that final semester, Dan was approached by 3 men. They didn't advertise who they were. They didn't offer him a job exactly, at least not in any normal sense. What they offered was access, a chance to work on something important. How would you like to see the world? A question with an implication very few people are ever asked, and I imagine even fewer decline. From that point forward, Dan's life entered the world of special access programs. In public, he maintained a completely ordinary appearance. For a time, Dan worked as a parole and probation officer for the state of Nevada, a position that he served as a cover. Occasionally, he also picked up shifts as a security guard for several Las Vegas casinos, the Sahara, Fiesta, and Aladdin. While these cover jobs paid the bills, they also provided a very convenient explanation for his schedule, his irregular hours, and his growing absence from the typical scientific community. Behind closed doors, however, Dan's real work was already underway. It was during this period that government agents would begin delivering him tissue samples of unknown origin. These samples were brought directly to his office for private analysis, accompanied by portable, high-powered microscopes. Dan never disclosed what these samples were, at least not initially, but the implication even then was clear. They were not from here. As his clearance levels increased, so too did the complexity of his assignments. According to Dan, the US Navy had already been quietly co-funding portions of his doctoral work, and soon another name entered the story, one of great significance. Dr. Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb. Teller, it seems, had taken a personal interest in Dan's research. With Teller's involvement, Dan was granted access to a specialized doctoral program through the State University of New York. His doctoral education at SUNY Stony Brook was not entirely conventional. While on the surface it appeared to follow standard biological science curriculum, Dan was already being quietly groomed by something more classified. A group known as the Majestic 12, sometimes simply called Majestic or MJ12. Officially, it didn't exist, but inside classified circles, it was one of the most powerful black world organizations ever assembled. Created in the 1940s to manage the growing problem of extraterrestrial contact, crash recoveries, and interspecies treaties. They operated outside of normal government channels, answered to no elected officials, and were tasked with maintaining total secrecy, not just from the public, but often from the very governments they were supposed to serve. Under Majestic 12 oversight, classified learning modules were quietly inserted into Dan's doctoral coursework, effectively functioning as an internal training pipeline for recruitment into the most classified of programs. The US Navy, acting as one of the Majestic stakeholders, fully funded parts of his doctoral work, while compartmentalized handlers evaluated his progress. He was flown to sunny Stony Brook periodically under military escort for the highly classified learning modules and examinations, though much of his coursework remained based in Las Vegas. Eventually, his professors from SUNY were themselves flown into Nevada to administer his final dissertation defense in person. By 1989, Dan had successfully completed his doctorate in cellular biology and molecular genetics. And with that, the final door opened. From this point forward, his assignments were no longer hypothetical. They were classified and they were compartmentalized, and they would eventually bring him face to face with something not of this world. A pause here to note something important. Like many parts of Dan Burisch's story, the details surrounding his education are complicated. Officially, there's little that can be independently verified. His degrees are documented in some records, including copies of diplomas, listings in Who's Who publications, and affidavits from those who claim to have supervised his work. Yet when inquiries were made to the universities directly, many of those records were either missing or denied entirely. Some point to this as evidence of fabrication, others suggest something far more deliberate. In my previous episode about Bob Lazar, I talked about a practice known as sheep dipping. For individuals involved in highly classified programs, it's not uncommon for personal records, academic, military or otherwise, to be systematically altered, erased or compartmentalized. It's a way of protecting not just the projects they worked on, but the individuals themselves, severing any easy connection between sensitive programs and the people attached to them. In Dan's case, whether that's what happened or not remains an open question. However, while much of Dan's background lives in shadows, there's one fact that stands firm and public. In 2008, Dan Burisch and Marcia McDowell gave a lecture in Caltech's Beckman Auditorium, a distinguished venue not typically open to fringe entertainers or speculative theorists. This is significant, because Beckman has hosted some of the most celebrated figures in science and culture: Stephen Hawking, Bill Gates, and my personal favourite, Sir Patrick Stewart. For a stage that has featured luminaries of global renown, Dan's presence creates a rare and undeniable trail in our collective record. So by the late 1980s, Dan Burisch's life had begun splitting in two. On the surface, he lived quietly in Las Vegas, still working as a parole officer and the occasional security guard job. Nothing remarkable, nothing to attract attention. But in the quiet spaces between, something else was happening. The phone calls came at irregular hours. Unmarked deliveries arrived at private lab spaces arranged for him, and inside those sealed containers were more tissue samples. The work started cautiously. The slides were pressure sealed. The specimens inside, unlike anything he'd previously encountered. Even then, Dan suspected these may have been biological warfare agents, perhaps engineered pathogens, perhaps foreign in origin. These samples, at least at first, were not fully explained to him. What Dan later came to understand was that these were not random biological specimens anymore. They were connected. They were part of a classified interspecies treaty. The materials originated under Majestic's Aquarius protocols, recovered biological tissues tied directly to the treaty programs established decades prior. This may sound unfamiliar, but don't worry, we'll get to all this later. The equipment he used was advanced, high-powered microscopes fitted with automated controls. Dan was not allowed to adjust the instruments himself. Instead, he would carry out changes verbally. Focus +2, contrast, adjust left. The modifications would be executed automatically, either by voice-activated systems or by unseen technicians somewhere else in the building. He was never told. Dan would later reflect that it was entirely possible another individual sitting in a separate room was manually executing those adjustments without knowing what he was even looking at. Each person holding a single piece of the puzzle, none allowed to see the full picture. This early work wasn't limited to Las Vegas. As his clearance deepened, Dan was periodically brought to Groom Lake itself, Area 51 proper, where specialized labs, such as Lab 8B, housed pressure-sealed biological warfare cabinets. There, the protocols were even stricter. Positive pressure suits, more automated equipment, and of course, more frustrating compartmentalization. After months of this routine, of focus rings moving a fraction too far, of slides drifting slightly off-center, he was eventually permitted a concession. A keyboard was installed, allowing him limited manual control over the microscope. A small but welcome privilege. But in these programs, even small privileges were earned. His assignments were irregular, the scheduling unpredictable. He might vanish for hours, sometimes days. There was no tidy explanations for his friends or family. When asked, He would give the kind of excuse that doesn't invite questions. Had to pick something up, ran out for cigarettes. It was the oldest alibi in the world, but it worked. At least at first. But over time, the assignments grew stranger, and sometimes they took him far from Nevada entirely. In 1991, during the Gulf War, Dan was quietly deployed overseas, not as a soldier, not as a uniformed officer, but as part of a black operations unit embedded within the larger international coalition forces in Iraq. His task, according to his testimony, was to identify and counteract a rogue military faction attempting to deploy unauthorized biological warfare agents on the battlefield. What exactly those agents were, or who sanctioned their development, remains unknown. When the mission was complete, Dan returned to Las Vegas, but things would not return to normal. Soon after, he received the orders that would lead him deeper than ever before. Dan was flown back to Groom Lake, better known to most as Area 51. The flight this time was uneventful, save for one surreal detail that Dan would never forget. At the private Janet terminal, the unmarked facility at McCarran Airport where the flights departed, the loudspeakers played Neil Diamond's Coming to America on repeat, a strangely cheerful anthem echoing softly through a place designed for people who were never supposed to speak about where they were going. Upon landing, the protocols immediately tightened. He was met by escorts who offered no names, no ranks, no insignia. And this time, Groom Lake wasn't his final destination. For that, he would be moved once more, 12 miles southwest into the mountains bordering Papoose Lake. A facility without signs, without records, without a public name. S4. From this point on, we'll let Dan tell the story. What follows is a reconstruction of his own testimony, his words and recollections, as if he was sitting here with us, sharing it himself, late one night at the Dreamland Motel. I never planned to be here. When I first agreed to work the slides back in Vegas, then Groom Lake, I assumed it was high contaminant pathogen research, something foreign, maybe dangerous, but terrestrial. But eventually the samples started to change. The structures, the cell membranes, the replication patterns, they stopped looking like anything I had ever studied. And then one day, without ceremony, they brought me to S4. The drive-in was silent, rough desert roads. The Cannonball Express, they call it. An unmarked transport van, no windows, bare steel interior, like being delivered inside a sealed metal coffin. No one spoke. When we arrived, the facility barely revealed itself. Concrete hangar doors carved into the rock face, no markings, no signs, no flags, just the blank face of secrecy. Inside, the world closed in even more. They stripped me, weighed me, scanned every square inch. Clothing, jewellery, even my wedding ring, all locked away. Everything catalogued, every gram accounted for. The security was absolute. Blue lines on the floor told me where I could walk. Red lines told me where I would die. The guards didn't explain the rules, they just watched. We called them the Black Seals. Navy maybe, something beyond. They wore no names, no insignia, only weapons and silence. Then came the briefing. They led me into a small windowless room, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Waiting for me was a single metal table, and on it a stack of blue binders. DTIC briefing books. I recently learned that DTIC stands for Defense Technical Intelligence Center. But for those of us inside the program, we called them the King Tuts. The binders weren't even made for this. Old military stock, repurposed for information that officially didn't exist. Inside the pages was Project Aquarius. If Majestic 12 was the umbrella, Aquarius was one of its most secret compartments. It handled biological interface programs, direct contact with non-human entities, the study of recovered life forms. That's when they told me. The tissue I'd been analysing wasn't Soviet. It wasn't a rogue state experiment. It wasn't from here. Extraterrestrial biological entities. And somewhere, maybe even in this same room years earlier, another man may have sat at this very same table. Bob Lazar. I don't know if that's true. But in programs like this, echoes tend to stack up. In fact, I too was told, just like Lazar was, that the aliens were from the Zeta Reticuli star system. I continued to read every page they allowed me to read. Some of it sounded like pure poppycock. Like stories layered on top of stories designed to test how far you'd believe. I still wasn't sure what was real. That would change soon enough. A few days later, the call came. I was being assigned to direct interface. They walked me down into level 4, biological containment, the ambassador suite, and the clean sphere. The protocols were absolute. The suiting process was closer to preparing for extravehicular activity than anything you'd find in a normal laboratory. The suit itself was full positive pressure TEC gear. Heavy, stiff, and unforgiving. A sealed life support system designed to isolate me completely from the internal atmosphere of the sphere. It wasn't built for my frame, too short in the legs, tight across the chest. Every joint resisted movement like I was fighting against hydraulic pressure. Layers of undergarments were applied first, conductive biosensors to monitor every vital sign. An interior communications harness wrapped across my jaw and helmet seals. They fitted the torso segment with care, locking heavy clasps into place. The gloves were affixed by sealed magnetic collars. Boot assemblies were locked over my feet, pressurized to avoid differential collapse. Once sealed, the helmet came last, lowered carefully, the collar twisting into its final locked position with a deep metallic click. From that moment on, I was completely self-contained, breathing nothing but bottled, triple-scrubbed air, monitored from multiple stations. Even the sweat on my skin was being recycled and analysed in real time. The medical clearances followed, spray showers, ultraviolet decontamination, neurocognitive baselines, encephalographic scans, heart rate stability tests. Any fluctuation and the mission would abort. But I passed, and I was cleared. Then the gantry engaged. The long mechanical arm extended slowly forward. A heavy steel bridge connecting the preparation chamber to the sphere itself. As the gantry locked into place, the iris hatch beneath me rotated open, like the pupil of an enormous artificial eye. The final chamber sealed behind me. There was no way back without full cycling. The sphere had swallowed me whole. The air inside shimmered faintly, electrically charged, ionized. Even through the suit, I could feel the tingling across my skin. The pressure was perfect, the oxygen content tuned, the atmosphere engineered like the interior of a spacecraft. Carefully balanced, precise, fragile. And there, standing at the far side, was the J-Rod. He stood perhaps 3.5 feet tall, though even at that small height, his frail frame seemed barely able to support itself. The body was thin, almost skeletal, with limbs that appeared elongated and fragile, swaying slightly with each micro-adjustment he made to keep balance. His skin was not smooth, as one might expect from these fictionalized greys. Instead, it was brownish, not fully uniform, with subtle variations of darker patches, like worn, weathered leather. A constant sheen of glycoprotein film coated his exterior, giving him a slightly wet, glistening appearance under the sterilized light of the clean sphere. The film wasn't sweat, it was part of his biology, a mucosal excretion that both protected him and signalled his deteriorating condition. In the air-conditioned silence of the sphere, you could almost see the faintest mist rise from his skin, as if his body itself was slowly vaporizing under the stress. His head was disproportionately large, bulbous even, sitting atop his narrow neck like a fragile dome. The back of the skull sloped gently, extending further than any human cranial structure. Veins and capillary beds beneath the semi-translucent skin occasionally pulsed under the soft interior lighting. His face carried no mouth movements, no nostrils, no familiar facial expressions. But none were needed. It was the eyes that dominated everything. The eyes. Enormous, almond-shaped, entirely black orbs that reflect almost no light, like 2 drops of liquid obsidian, bottomless. When they locked onto mine, it felt less like being watched and more like being scanned, as though he was reading not just my face, but the totality of my thoughts, my fears, my history, my secrets. Within those eyes there was no hostility, but neither was there kindness. It was something else entirely. Tired wisdom, a deep, weary knowledge that stretched far beyond anything I could comprehend. As I stood frozen, observing him, I noticed the slight tremor in his fingers. He carried 4 digits on each hand, longer and thinner than a human's, and flexing irregularly, as if the neuropathy that plagued his species was active even in the moments of stillness. Occasionally he shifted his weight back and forth, the movement subtle, compensating for joint weakness and internal pain. His breathing was nearly imperceptible. His chest rose and fell so slowly it resembled the steady expansion of a balloon in slow motion, controlled and almost mechanical. Every detail of his physiology whispered the same truth. He was sick. And yet, despite the frailty, despite the degenerative weight pressing upon his body, there was an undeniable presence radiating from him. Something ancient, something heavy with knowledge, something familiar. I wasn't looking at a giant insect. I wasn't looking at some sort of old-world ape. I wasn't looking at a monster. I was looking at a survivor. It was understood that I wasn't to communicate with the J-Rod at all. In fact, he had apparently made a promise of his own, not to speak with anyone except the approved representative assigned to him. I was there to observe, to perform assigned procedures, nothing more. Every protocol was designed to maintain absolute control. Everything except him. As promised, he never spoke aloud either. But he didn't need to. As I stood there, barely breathing inside the heavy tech suit, I felt something reach out. Not physically, but internally. A gentle pull at the edges of my consciousness. My thoughts quieted. My anxiety dissolved like mist under the morning sun. Neural entrainment. The same process that regulated my panic during first entry, now tuned with careful precision. And then, without warning or ceremony, his presence entered my mind. The words weren't spoken, but they arrived with crystalline clarity. I won't hurt you. A simple message of reassurance. In that moment, I understood. He initiated contact. It wasn't part of the training. and it wasn't authorized. The Majestic protocols didn't account for this kind of interaction, but we both knew that neither of us fully belonged to those protocols anymore. The first session remained controlled. He stood still. I collected preliminary environmental readings. No direct sampling occurred yet. That would come later. For now, it was enough simply to stand within reach of one another. Two creatures, two different realities, two different histories, staring across the short but infinite distance between our lives. I was observing him, and he was observing me. But under the surface, something else had already begun. In the days that followed, I returned. Each time the routine grew slightly less mechanical. The neural entrainment became smoother. The silent exchanges longer. His presence more familiar. Emotions were shared before facts. A kind of empathic bridge was forming. There were moments when it almost felt like we had known each other for far longer than these brief sessions. And maybe, in some inexplicable way, we had. As the work progressed, my assignments evolved into cytoplasmic extractions, carefully removing damaged tissue samples to create treatment grafts, hoping to slow his neuropathy. These were delicate procedures, performed under tight biological protocols. The material we extracted wasn't simply inert tissue. It carried active, dynamic genetic data, unlike any known terrestrial biology. It was both him and not him, a copy of a species at the far end of its survival arc. Each successful extraction extended his stability. Each failure risked collapse. We were no longer operating on pure science. We were buying time. As the months went on, something else happened. I stopped seeing him as the subject, and he stopped seeing me as the technician. We became something else. Two prisoners inside a system neither of us had designed, bound together by silent agreements, shared glimpses, and the strange quiet that only exists between two beings who both know too much and yet still understand so little. At some point, it became impossible for those in the observation gallery to pretend they hadn't noticed. The protocols forbade communication, but the connection was there, unfolding in plain sight. There were the subtle things first, the involuntary smirk behind my faceplate when J-Rod would flash me some private irony only we shared. The brief tilt of his head, the faint shimmer in his oversized eyes when he found something amusing, often at my expense. A kind of quiet humour passed between us, impossible to fully conceal. But it wasn't just the non-verbal cues. It was my work. The direction my research began to take veered into areas they hadn't anticipated, exploring ideas, proposing protocols, identifying correlations that, by all accounts, I shouldn't have had the data to justify. It didn't take long for Majestic to understand. I was being told more than I was authorized to know. They saw it. And while the insubordination was clear, even those in control understood. Progress required concessions. The work was too delicate, the insights too valuable. And so they let it continue, not because they approved, but because the alternative was slower failure. At first, I thought the growing attention from upstairs was simply a matter of record keeping. Another layer of Majestic tightening its grip, watching the cracks in the protocols widen. But then came the briefing I didn't expect. I was informed, quietly, without fanfare, that I was being promoted. Working group leader. Technically now senior to the man I believed was far more qualified to hold the position, Stephen. Stephen had more experience, more years, more credentials. In every conventional sense, he was better suited for leadership. I respected him deeply. And yet, they handed the position to me. No explanation was offered, but I already knew why. The J-Rod had asked for me. The bond we'd been forming, those subtle neural exchanges, the silent humour, the emotional resonance, it wasn't simply tolerated anymore. It was being recognised as operationally useful. Stephen remained as my second, but I always considered him equal. He would continue his work, but from that point forward, the primary interface responsibility was mine. Even now, I don't know if the promotion was purely tactical, a way to accelerate the research, to placate the entity, or simply another form of quiet manipulation. Majestic was never known for giving answers. But one thing was certain. The system was adapting to the bond that none of us had planned for. The longer we worked together, the harder it became to separate what I was feeling from what he was feeling. At first it was simple empathy, a professional's concern for his patient. But as our entrainment sessions deepened, the separation between us began to thin. The neural link was no longer just a calming mechanism. It became a shared channel open both ways. He explained that J-Rod wasn't truly a name. It was assigned by my own people, by Majestic's Sigma linguistics team, to catalogue his presence in the treaty system. The term was numeric in origin, the letter J representing 10, the 10th letter of the alphabet, and Rod, drawn from Mayan and Egyptian counting systems, where a rod symbol represented 5. Together, 5 plus 10 equals 15. The designation referred not to his individuality, but to his classification. He was one of several assigned to various NHI species and biological programs. His actual name, his personal identity, was something I was not authorized to know. Not yet. In time, he told me where he was from. Not just where, but when. Approximately 52,000 years into our future. At the time of our meeting, his biological age was 622 years. He explained that his people were not aliens, at least not in the way the world imagined. They were human, or had once been. A divergent branch of our own species, shaped by catastrophic timeline disruptions thousands of years ahead of my present. Somewhere along our distant future, a series of compounding disasters fractured the human genome. Nuclear wars, environmental collapse, radiological damage, and eventually a reliance on cloning that led to genetic degradation. The result was his people, neurologically compromised, dependent on technology, barely able to reproduce without intervention. Survivors, but at great cost. He revealed that his own presence was not by accident. He had arrived following a recovery event, what my people referred to as the Kingman incident. In 1953, a craft under control of his species suffered a malfunction and crash-landed outside of Kingman, Arizona. The surviving crew, including him, were recovered by US military forces and brought into containment separately. Over time, treaty negotiations followed, allowing for limited biological interaction and exchange programs between factions of his people and Majestic. These treaties became known as the Tau Treaty Systems, a series of highly classified arrangements negotiated between Majestic 12 and multiple factions of future human lineages. The treaties covered everything from biological sampling protocols to limited technological exchanges, to tightly restricted contact procedures, and sanctioned abductions. But these agreements were never fixed. As new developments unfolded, and as Majestic discovered more about reality, the treaties were forced into regular review cycles. Each cycle reopened old negotiations, revisiting the fragile balance between scientific ambition and existential risk. The J-Rod species was only one of several involved. Through their sessions, he spoke of others, the P-52 Orions, a highly advanced, genetically stabilized branch of humanity from approximately 52,000 years in the future. The P-45 J-Rods, a divergent timeline from approximately 45,000 years ahead, still suffering severe genetic collapse from catastrophic events tied to earlier technological mistakes. And then there was the J-Rod that I knew, classified as P-52K under the Treaty Codex. Though part of the same distant future as the Orions, his lineage remained genetically damaged, carrying forward the physical degeneration that had plagued the J-Rod line for tens of thousands of years. All these groups, he explained, were engaged in complex treaty negotiations with Majestic, balancing access to biological material, technological exchange, and the management of timeline paradoxes that had become increasingly unstable. That was where the J-Rod's role came in. He wasn't just a subject in a laboratory. He was treaty interface. His presence inside S4 wasn't captivity in the traditional sense. It was part of an agreement, a controlled point of contact where both sides exchanged what they needed under heavily restricted protocols. In these programs, interface meant more than simply meeting. It meant being the physical bridge between two fractured branches of humanity, the one allowed to sit inside the ambassador's suite, the one authorized to speak, or in his case, to think, across the gap. Two species, two futures, negotiating survival. As time went on and our interfaces continued, the connection we had became vivid. He carried a weight that was difficult to describe. Not fear, not even anger. Exhaustion. Not surprising at 622. A species stretched across time, surviving long past its natural arc, but at great cost. The J-Rod lived inside a body that no longer fully obeyed him. Every small movement, raising a hand, lifting his head, flexing his fingers, required visible effort. Beneath his eyes, there was a kind of fatigue, not just physical but emotional, the weight of too many years, the knowledge of what his kind had lost. He was dying, slowly, relentlessly, and he knew it. The neuropathy advanced regardless of our work, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, but always forward. The cytoplasmic extractions I performed were necessary to generate graft material that might buy him more time, but each procedure was painful for him. What made it unbearable was that I didn't even have to imagine his pain. I felt it. When I would pierce the skin, when the samples were drawn, I experienced the same sharp internal spikes he did. Not as an observer, not in sympathy, in synchrony. The tears that would well up behind my faceplate were not mine alone. They were ours. We shared them. At times, during sampling, I could feel his pulse falter, his muscles tighten involuntarily, and even in the shared agony, he would sometimes whisper into my thoughts, "It's all right, Bene. You are helping." Bene. He called me that before in casual conversation, many times now, but this time with the ghost of a tear running down his cheek. It landed differently, deeper. A weight dropped into my chest that I hadn't been prepared for. Bene. That was my childhood nickname, a name only my family used, given to me when I was small, after some old cartoon my grandmother used to play. Nobody in this facility knew it. Nobody in this program could have known it. Nobody except him. And suddenly it was there, not just as a memory unfolding, but as a door snapping open inside my mind. The park, the baseball, the sunlight, my grandfather calling out, the missing time. The hands, the light, the strange room, the faces above me, familiar but not human. It was no longer a faceless encounter. It was him. It had always been him. I don't know how long I stood there in that moment. Even inside the tech suit, behind the sealed glass, I could feel his awareness watching mine, not apologizing or justifying, but simply present. We were no longer strangers, and we never have been. From that point forward, everything between us changed. We both understood exactly who we were to each other now. Two threads tangled across timelines. Two beings separated by over 50,000 years, and by a decision neither of us had ever fully chosen. The abducted child, and the being who took him. I couldn't stop it. The emotion came rushing in, like a breach in my own mental pressure suit. Grief, confusion, awe. None of it had a name big enough. I could barely see through the tears now streaming down my face. Not just my own. Ours. His flowing through a link, mine falling freely. I felt everything he felt, the isolation, the exhaustion, the unbearable weight of time. And suddenly, I knew this wasn't just my pain. This was the sorrow of a being who had carried too much for too long. He moved, not aggressively, not to harm, but to comfort. He stepped forward, slow at first, then quicker, instinctual. Maybe he wanted to steady me. Maybe he wanted to be near somebody who finally remembered him. But to me, in that moment, it felt like the world collapsing. Too close, too fast, too much. I staggered back, and my boot caught the edge of the sphere's flooring. The weight of the suit pulled me sideways. I went down hard, flat on my back. The chamber lights flickered slightly. Somewhere behind the glass, I knew the alarms were already activating. And then he was above me. He climbed onto my chest, not forcefully, but gently, placing both of his hands on my upper plate, like someone steadying a shaking child. His face came close, so close I could see the glycoprotein film ripple slightly with each breath. And just like that, it opened. The neural channel we shared burst wide open like a breaking dam. No barriers, no filters, no restraint. What followed wasn't a message, and it wasn't a memory. It was everything. A flood of knowledge slammed into me. The timelines, the wars, the failed interventions, the looking glass, the Stargates, the treaty collapses, the genetic degradation, the slow, painful realization that his people were not visitors but descendants. A future trying to survive by reaching into their past. I saw the Kingman crash, the recovery, the experiments, the arguments inside Majestic, and I saw him, living in that cell, growing weaker every day, remembering a child he once saw lifted into the sky under a warm afternoon sun. Finally, I saw myself, and I saw him. And in that moment, we were no longer separate beings. We were one mind, split by time, weaving itself back together under fluorescent lights and layers of containment protocol. I don't remember falling unconscious. I only remember the last thing I heard in my mind. I'm sorry. When I woke, I was somewhere else, a medical containment room with bright lights. The quiet hum of filtration systems and the smell of antiseptic hanging in the air. No clean sphere, no interface chamber, no J-rod. They kept me under observation for days. Every moment was monitored. Neurological scans, blood panels, cognitive baselines. I wasn't allowed to speak with anyone outside the immediate recovery team. Even among the doctors, there was little conversation. Their job wasn't to comfort me. Their job was to assess whether I had become a liability. The data I had received, the download, was now part of me. A living record embedded in my memory, uncontrolled, unstructured, and unclear. They couldn't take it back. They couldn't extract it. All they could do was measure me and decide what to do next. The interface program was immediately suspended, the clean sphere sealed, no further biological extractions authorized. Majestic had reached the end of what it was willing to tolerate. From that point forward, my involvement changed. I wasn't an active technician anymore. I became something else, a custodian of classified memory. There were debriefings, endless, circular, exhausting. Panels of men I'd never seen before, carefully worded questions, psychological evaluations dressed up as interrogations. What did you see? How much do you remember? Do you believe any of it? Did he manipulate you? Were you compromised? I learned very quickly what the safe answers were, when to volunteer information, and when to simply say, I don't know. I cooperated as much as I could, and where I couldn't, I stalled for time. The knowledge I received was still settling inside me. I could feel pieces of it surfacing in waves, dreams, flashes, images that would rise without warning. It wasn't linear, it wasn't orderly. It was like looking down at a jigsaw puzzle, where some of the pieces belonged to different pictures entirely. And behind it all was the silence, the absence of J-Rod. At S4, that would be the last time I saw him. But in time, our paths would cross once more. And that is where Dan's own words end, for now. From here on, we step outside the sphere. What follows is no longer a narrative of his direct account, but what we've been able to reconstruct from his testimony, from the alleged classified briefings, from surrounding testimony, and from slow leaking of secrets that were never meant to surface. Because while his personal work with the J-Rod was finished, the story of Majestic and its collapse was still unfolding. By the late 1990s, the work inside Majestic was beginning to change. What had started decades earlier as a secretive recovery program, one focused on crash retrievals, reverse engineering, and biological interface, was now unraveling under the weight of something far more unstable: time itself. The biological treaties with J-Rod's people were only one piece of a much larger structure, one that Majestic had kept hidden even from many within its own ranks. At the centre of it was a system. Not alien technology exactly, but something retrieved, modified, and built into operational use under human control. They called it Looking Glass, a device capable, at least in theory, of peering forward, not seeing the future in the way we imagine it, not one fixed outcome, not one destined path, but a range of probable timelines, variations, branching possibilities, some closer together, some wildly divergent. But Looking Glass wasn't just a viewing system. According to Dan's testimony, the devices were engineered as controlled Einstein-Rosen-bridge systems, capable of creating temporary, spatial-temporal distortions inside highly stabilized containment fields. In simple terms, small, controlled wormholes. Integral to their operation was a familiar material to us, but few in the world have ever seen: Element 115. An unknown quantity of 115 had been recovered during the Kingman, Arizona crash, and without it, the system simply wouldn't function. Attempts to replicate its effects through terrestrial means had failed. The element's exotic properties, gravitational and energetic, made the devices both irreplaceable and unimaginably dangerous. A twin device, sometimes called the sister platform, was believed to be housed not far from the primary system, inside the restricted boundaries of Area 51 itself. Ironically, the theory at the time suggested that keeping both platforms close together might somehow improve stability, as if proximity mattered. But distance, of course, becomes almost meaningless when you're folding space itself. The very existence of the devices called into question some of the most fundamental assumptions we have in physics. At one point, testing expanded beyond observation. Researchers began exploring whether Looking Glass could allow limited physical transfer, actual displacement through the bridge. Non-living materials were first to enter. Inert matter passed through the portal and reappeared intact on the other side. For a brief time, it appeared to work, until a human subject volunteered. There are few things Dan isn't willing to talk about at S4. On occasion, he's recalled hearing the screams of animals being tested, echoing through the elevator shaft as he made his way down to his assigned level. From watching his testimony, it's clear that certain memories give a bitter taste in his mouth. The attempt to teleport a human through Looking Glass is one such memory. What little he has shared is simple. I was there, I saw it. It was not survivable, and I don't want to talk about it anymore. What emerged from the wormhole after that test was not something anyone involved would ever forget. The experiment was quickly terminated. That particular avenue of exploration was closed, and from that moment forward, any further human trials were quietly abandoned. Even inside Majestic, many simply referred to Looking Glass as the machine we were never supposed to build. However, setting the unimaginable gore aside, Majestic continued to use Looking Glass to study these timelines, to anticipate potential catastrophic outcomes tied to the treaties, the hybridization programs, and the ongoing interaction with divergent future human factions. What they discovered was not comforting. The data showed recurring convergence points, moments where certain decisions, certain interventions, consistently led toward timeline collapse. War, genetic bottlenecks, global destabilization, and in too many scenarios, the emergence of the very beings they were already negotiating with, the J-Rods. This led to the creation of what came to be known as the Doctrine of the Convergent Timeline Paradox. The simple version was this: the more they interfered, the more likely they were to create the very future they were trying to avoid. Majestic found itself trapped inside its own recursive logic loop. Every solution they tested with Looking Glass seemed to reinforce the problem. The data became unstable. Even the scientists running the projections no longer agreed on what they were seeing. Some argued for more intervention. Others argued for total disengagement. The internal fractures widened. Debates turned into threats. Alliances within Majestic began to fracture under the pressure. And behind closed doors, the question no one could fully answer: had they already gone too far? As the 2000s approached, the once unified Majestic structure was collapsing. But for Dan Burisch, his role inside Majestic was not entirely over. In fact, if anything, his importance to the program was only increasing. He was no longer just a scientist. He was now a living repository of knowledge that Majestic itself could barely contain. Information drawn not only from his direct interface with J-Rod, but from treaty briefings, Looking Glass projections, and biological data very few were ever allowed to see. So by the late 1990s, as the treaties entered their most fragile phase, Dan's role changed yet again. He was brought directly into the Tau 9 negotiation structure, acting not simply as a researcher, but as a key human representative inside Majestic's final treaty work. And as part of those negotiations, he was granted access to one of the most controversial and dangerous devices Majestic had ever received: the Yellow Book. Sometimes called the Cube, it was a small portable device no larger than a box, originally gifted to the Eisenhower administration during early treaty discussions. It was supposed to be handed to the United Nations, a symbol that might have united humanity under one shared purpose, allowing all nations to face their future together. But it never made it. Instead, the device was quietly retained inside the most restricted levels of Majestic, buried away as a strategic advantage, far from public sight, and even farther from international oversight. The cube could display possible futures, branching timelines, probability streams, and potential catastrophes yet to unfold. But the visions it produced were not purely objective. The data was psychically reactive, shaped by the emotional state, intent, and subconscious fears of the person viewing it. It's almost the tool that the universe itself uses to decide what to do next. This made it wildly dangerous, especially in the hands of political and military leadership. The images shown could be manipulated by the very hopes and terrors of the observer. You can imagine that under the influence of a religious dogma, a tool like this could push you down some pretty dark avenues. Under careful guidance, Dan used the Yellow Book as a tool of leverage during the final Tau 9 treaty sessions, presenting grim potential futures that ultimately helped push Majestic's partners towards compromise. Through these negotiations, the genetic hybridization programs were halted, the abduction phenomena was formally closed, and humanity's most dangerous involvements were, at least temporarily, withdrawn. But there was a price. The Looking Glass systems, once seen as humanity's greatest scientific leap, were increasingly shown to be directly involved in the paradoxes leading towards planetary destruction. The more Majestic interfered with the timeline, the more likely they were to create the very future they were trying to avoid. The doctrine of the Convergent timeline paradox was no longer theoretical. It was now a confirmed failure point. At the insistence of both the J-Rods and Orions, and with treaty pressure mounting, the Looking Glasses were dismantled, fully decommissioned by the early 2000s. But these portals weren't only human-made. Another kind of gateway existed. Naturally occurring distortions in space-time, subtle folds embedded in the structure of Earth itself. Einstein-Rosen bridges, formed not by technology, but by nature. Under very specific conditions, these natural nodes could open brief connections between different points in space and time. Some had been known since ancient days, whispered in mythology, hidden beneath sacred sites, encoded into ancient texts. And one of the most stable lay beneath the sands of Egypt. By late 2003, most of Majestic's direct operations had wound down, the Looking Glass devices dismantled, and most of these Stargates hidden or destroyed. The Tau 9 treaties had entered their final stages. But one last protocol remained. Officially, it was framed as a diplomatic extension, a continuation of Majestic's biological interface agreements, a final communications event. The J-Rod was scheduled to attempt contact with his political structure through one of Earth's remaining natural displacement nodes, an Einstein-Rosen bridge embedded beneath Egypt. Now, if you asked most people where something like this might happen, they'd likely picture the Giza Plateau, the pyramids, the Sphinx, all the familiar faces. But ironically, it wasn't Giza at all. The operation took place further south, at a site few tourists ever visit, the Temple of Abydos. One of Egypt's oldest sacred sites. For thousands of years, Abydos has been tied to myths of death and resurrection, to journeys into the afterlife. And beneath its ancient stone, far older than what most see on the surface, sat one of the most stable natural Einstein-Rosen bridges Majestic had identified. These weren't human-made portals. They weren't engineered by any civilization. They were simply part of the planet itself. Natural distortions in space-time. Subtle folds. Majestic had known about these locations for decades, monitoring them quietly, far from public view. The mission itself was highly compartmentalized. Few were cleared to know the details. No flight manifests, no public record. Let's now step back into Dan's mind. What follows is not a direct transcript, but a reconstruction, an interpretation of Dan's own testimony, pieced together from his interviews, briefings, and public disclosures. The words may be ours, but the experience, as best as anyone can tell it, is his. I was brought in quietly, flown in with only a handful of personnel cleared for this specific operation. My presence wasn't automatic. The biological interface program had already been suspended. My technical role, officially, was complete. But, for reasons not fully explained to me, and likely debated within Majestic itself, I was requested to accompany the mission. Some argued it was for medical continuity, that my familiarity with his physiology made me uniquely suited to monitor his condition. But the truth was simpler. After everything we had shared together in the clean sphere, I was the only human he trusted. He was transported separately, heavily secured, handled under strict protocols by teams who likely didn't fully understand who or what they were escorting. When we reached the chamber beneath Abydos, the portal was already active. A soft hum filled the chamber, like standing inside some vast, invisible engine. The air shimmered faintly, as if reality itself was vibrating. This was not an artificial Stargate. This was nature, with just enough technological assistance to stabilize it for controlled interaction. The official orders were clear. He would initiate limited communication. Data transfer would be monitored. But standing beside him, I could feel what this really was. This was never just about data. I stood just behind him, watching his small frame inside the portable glass chamber illuminated by the glow of the portal. There was a brief hesitation, and then he reached into my mind one final time. Not with information, not with science, with something far simpler. Kiela. That was his name, the only name he ever gave me. And in hearing it, I realized something. In that moment, he wasn't a project, or a subject, or a biological interface. He was a human. A being who had spent decades as a prisoner. A life held in place by treaties, by programs, by protocols. And he was tired. He might not have looked like us, but he deserved what all people deserve. Love, liberty, freedom, and the dignity to choose his own path. And there, standing deep beneath Egypt, I made my decision. I placed my hand gently on the back of his containment unit. No orders, no permission, and I pushed his chamber through the portal. I didn't know if he would survive, but I knew that whatever happened, he'd already forgiven me. The field rippled and he passed through. No flash of light, no sound, no sci-fi spectacle. Just a brief shimmer, and then he was gone. Something threw me backward onto the stone platform as the energy collapsed behind him. That was the last time I ever saw him. With his departure, the final biological treaty obligation was complete. Majestic's most secret contract closed. And yet, they didn't kill me. By every rule I'd ever known inside Majestic, I should have been expendable. I had broken the rules. I had assisted in the unauthorized transfer and escape of a treaty delegate. And I now carried, alone, years of data they could never fully extract. Not just technical data or briefings or files or archives, but the unstructured memories, the private exchanges, the quiet hours inside the clean sphere where information passed between us in ways no report could ever capture. I was, in a very real sense, the final repository of his knowledge on this side of the timeline. And that, perhaps, is why they let me live. Because long before the portal closed, Majestic had already lost control. They knew it. The treaties were ending, the timelines were collapsing, and whatever happened next, they would need people like me, if only as insurance for whatever came after. That was how Dan described it, the final years. The quiet winding down of something that was never meant to last. By 2005, the structure known as Majestic 12, once the most secretive black world apparatus on Earth, was, for all intents and purposes, dissolved. The looking glass devices dismantled. The vast machinery that once negotiated the future human lineages, monitored timeline convergences, and sought to control technologies it barely understood, was shut down. But Majestic didn't entirely vanish. What remained was something quieter, and in some ways, stranger. The core authority was gone. The formal projects were archived, sealed, or divided between various international custodians. But fragments of Majestic's old inner circle lingered on, not as powerful operators, but as custodians of an almost ritualistic tradition. Private gatherings, closed-door meetings, symbolic proceedings that now resembled something closer to a secret society than a government program. For some it became a kind of religion, a sanctuary, a place for old men who once held enormous weight on their shoulders to gather and perform the old rites. The language of clearance codes, of compartmentalized files, of doctrines and protocols preserved, but no longer truly actionable. Majestic still acted as if it wielded influence, as if the world still needed its hand upon the wheel, but in reality, they were no longer driving. The ritual remained, the responsibility was gone. After Majestic collapsed, Dan quietly continued his work on a project known as Lotus, an investigation into what he described as a universal regenerative force hidden inside the quantum level of biology itself. While Majestic had pursued timelines, Stargates, and political treaties, Lotus was different. It wasn't about power or control or technology. It was about life. And while the old corridors of power faded into ritual, Dan continued quietly exploring the one mystery that had always remained: how we heal, how we exist, and whether something far deeper may be guiding it all. What follows now is not taken from briefings or timelines or official transcripts. It's what he shared quietly late last night, right here at the Motel bar. You know, I used to think the hardest part of all this was the secrecy, the protocols, the weight of knowing things you couldn't share. But it wasn't. Not really. The hardest part was losing him. You spend years with someone like that, not just observing him, but feeling him, inside your mind, inside your emotions. sharing thoughts that didn't need words. We weren't just researcher and subject. No. Somewhere along the way, we became something closer to friends, brothers, or father and son. And then one day, he was gone. That portal closed, and it took him with it. And I was left behind, here. I sometimes wonder if that's why I kept working on Lotus. Maybe it was never really about the cells or the flashes of light or the Ganesh particles. Maybe it was just me looking for some way to keep him close. A way to understand how something like him, like us, could even exist. Or maybe, if I'm being honest, it was wishful thinking. A foolish hope that somewhere buried in the code of life itself was a doorway, one that might bring him back. But there are no more doorways, for now at least. It's just the work and the memories and the silence. Thanks for the drink. Dan stood up from his stool, nodded politely, and walked out into the night, presumably to finally get a long, well-earned sleep. Thanks for joining us tonight at the Dreamland Motel. A special thanks to Clint Weldon of the Night Shift podcast for his inspiration, and to Brian Jackson for creating by far the most comprehensive fountain of knowledge on tonight's subject, without which this episode would not have been possible. You can find links to both their works in the description. If you enjoyed tonight's story, feel free to leave a comment, a like, or share it with someone who might need a quiet place to sit and listen. We hope you enjoyed your stay. You're always welcome. And remember, you've always been taught that monsters aren't real, but they do exist, and they live in the hearts of men.
In my sleep, calling